Hello, welcome then to this week's episode as we continue with our journey looking at behaviour in schools. In this week's episode, we're going to start looking at behaviour scenarios. We're going to focus particularly on what happens if a student swears at a teacher, but we will look in future episodes at things like if a student's late or forgets their exercise book, or if they interrupt a lesson, or even if they fall asleep in the lesson, which, believe it or not, might actually happen. So let's get into this. So then, in this week's episode, we are looking what happens if a student swears at a teacher in a lesson. It does happen, unfortunately, from time to time. I think it's happening more now than it has done, say, 10, 15 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. It just seems to be that students are a lot more familiar with language and don't seem to have any problems with expressing that language when they're frustrated. And that is the key, really, is just understanding that it is when they're frustrated. And it could be frustration with you, it could be frustration with other students, with things that are going on in their own life. So there's a lot to take on board here, and hopefully we'll try and explain it. What we're going to do is we're going to go through kind of 5 steps. We're going to look at, staying calm first of all, addressing the behaviour, explaining the consequences, redirecting the conversation, and then the follow-up. And we'll try and explain it in different scenarios. Really, the basics is starting off with your own behaviour policy, because your policy will determine how you're going to deal with things. Different schools will have different policies around swearing, and some policies will be very explicit around what you need to do. For example, some schools may choose to not suspend for swearing at staff. Other schools will be very clear that they do suspend for it, and it's immediate suspension. Some schools will say that it has to be directed at the teacher. Some schools will say that it doesn't matter if it's indirect, if they swear just generally in the presence of a teacher. So really, it's just establishing what is your policy to start off with. That's the first thing you want to do. And again, the main thing really, like with all the behaviour advice, is if you're never sure about if you're not sure what to do, then go to head of year or to the senior leaders in your school who are in charge of behaviour and ask them for advice. The one thing I would say is that when someone does swear, it's not acceptable. And so whatever your policy is, you've got to follow it. But I'm going to go with the general advice of what I would do, what we do in our school, and hopefully that'll be useful for you. Certainly, we don't have any tolerance. We do not tolerate any swearing at staff, regardless of the situation. It's just not acceptable. So we do suspend for it. And we're very clear on that. And we make that very clear. And again, with a lot of the behaviour, it's about really communicating that and educating students on what is acceptable behaviour, particularly since COVID. One of the things that's really important is about explaining to students what the expectations are, because they're having to learn behaviour all over again. So when it comes to swearing, being really clear about not accepting it is the main thing, and sticking to your policy. So that's kind of like your starting point. So let's just get into this scenario of looking at a lesson where students come in, and it could be the beginning of the lesson, middle of the end of the lesson, or the end of the lesson. It doesn't really matter when it takes place. You're going to pretty much follow the same procedure, which is starting point is to stay calm. When a student swears at you, it's normally because there's some sort of confrontation. We mentioned before about students wanting 2 things: they either want something or they want to avoid it. And so you don't really need to worry about which one it is in this moment, but it's useful to reflect on that afterwards. In the moment, the main thing is stay calm. That's your number one. You stay calm and make sure you don't react. Now, a lot of the time where I've seen people deal with behaviour and deal with it badly, it's because they go for what I call the playground mentality of the response. So a student says something and they will literally just go, well, no, I didn't, or respond in a way that's kind of that tit for tat. So it's like, well, you said this, no, you said that, you said this one, you said that. And that's what we've got to make sure we don't get into. So when a student swears, it's about staying calm. You need to be really clear that you're not going to let your emotions get to you, because at the moment when they do it, particularly when you're early, if you're a new teacher, first time a student swears at you, it will throw you. It will literally make you kind of feel angry, annoyed, upset. You may then start to think about yourself, and I think it's important that you reflect on the situation afterwards. Talk to another colleague as well. It's really important after the first time it happens that you kind of talk to somebody else about it and get some kind of emotional support on it, because it can be quite shocking, it can be quite upsetting. I think once you get later on in your career and you become more confident as a teacher and more experienced, you start to realise that these things just do happen. And sometimes staff will say to me, well, how is it when that student's rude to you, or they're aggressive, or particularly non-compliant, you just don't react? And it's because you just become more experienced and realizing it's about them and their issues, nothing to do with you. It's no reflection on me. Obviously, I do need to reflect on what I've done in case I've antagonized that student, and sometimes that can happen by accident. You can do everything right sometimes, and a student will still choose to react to you because of they're having a bad day, or something's happened to them, or something's going on in their home life. It doesn't mean it's acceptable though. So we stay calm. You need to make sure that you are responding to them to say, look, it's not acceptable, etc. So that's kind of step 2 really. Step 2 is to address the behavior and say, look, that language isn't acceptable. Please don't speak to me that way. And just be really clear in acknowledging that. Now, if they've said it not directly to you, again, it comes back to your school policy. It is important that you don't just ignore that language, because other students will have witnessed it. And so if your school policy is that you don't suspend for that, but there is a sanction, then you need to address it and just kind of put it to one side and decide how you're going to deal with it according to your policy. Within my school and schools that I've worked in, if a student swears at you directly, it's a suspension. If it's indirectly, it depends on what they've said as to what the sanction will be. If it's really kind of serious, upsetting, or kind of hateful language, or if it's about you, not necessarily directed at you, then there might still be quite serious consequences. But in general, if it's just like, oh, I'm effing annoyed, or you're peeing me off, then we might deal with it different, and we might still issue them a sanction, but it tends to be internal. And again, it all depends on the scenario, but I'm talking about someone who's just told you to go and F yourself, and basically you're going to deal with them for it because you can't tolerate that, it's not acceptable, and no one should be subject to any verbal abuse within the classroom. So what you need to do is explain the consequences. Now, by explaining the consequences doesn't mean, please do never say to a student, because remember, it's the head teacher's decision to suspend a student, is never the teacher's. So you cannot turn around to a student and say, well, you're going to be suspended for that. What you can say is there will be consequences for this. You can't speak to me like that. Most schools would probably have a remove system for this, where they call for the person on call or a senior leader to come and collect that student. And so that's probably your next thing that you need to do. So you've stayed calm, you've addressed the behavior, and then you're explaining the consequences. So there'll now be consequences. I'm not having you speak to me like that. You will now be removed from the lesson. And you might go through your system, whether it's warnings. We have a warning, sanction, removal. So you might go through your systems. Please remember though, you shouldn't really be giving them a warning saying, please don't swear at me again. If swearing is not accepted in your school, you go straight to kind of the final step, if that makes sense. Again, following your policy. So you'd explain the consequences, and then what you'd need to do is then call for that support and assistance, and you'd redirect the conversation. So in other words, you would try and get other students back onto what they're supposed to be doing. You'd kind of park that, don't engage in any further conversation. If they've already swore at you, there's no point pursuing that conversation any further. There's no point having an argument. One of the things I always explain to staff when we talk about a consequence for something is, if someone has swore at you, there'll be a consequence. You don't need to escalate it further. You don't need to have an argument to try and win it. Ultimately, it will be dealt with at a later date. By all means, save face by not just accepting it, but don't get into a stand-up row with someone, is what I'm trying to say. What you should say is just say, look, let's just call him Billy. Billy, it's not acceptable. I shouldn't be spoken to that way. I'm not trying to upset you, but unfortunately I can't have that in this lesson. So now we will remove you from the lesson, or I'll send someone to collect you because I'm not having that. You'll need to be removed, and then I will follow this up afterwards. And then that kind of leads to your last step, which is the follow-up. So the follow-up is really, really important. First of all, document everything, write it down, try and stay calm. Remember, keep the emotion out of it. One of the things when someone swore at you is it's really easy to fall into that idea of just being really kind of emotional about it and angry and upset. And particularly one of the things I hear from teachers sometimes, they say, I've never been spoken to, I'm not having that person back in my lesson, blah, blah, blah. And it's really easy to fall into that. Remember, if you look at the teacher standards, it's really clear. And within most policies, it will say that, you know, teachers cannot refuse to have a student back in their lesson. What you can do is you can ask for support, you can ask for a bit of respite, but you can't dictate. And sometimes that's where teachers go wrong. So it's just advice really to say, don't go up to senior leadership and say, I'm not having them back in again, I'm refusing, blah, 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 because you can't. First of all, you can't actually do that. It's against the teacher standards and conditions. What you can do is say, look, I don't feel comfortable with them back in there. I'm really not happy the way they spoke to me. Could you support me? I'd prefer it if they were removed for the next lesson until we can have a restorative conversation. And you can request that, but be advised that you may be told, no, you've got to have them back in. But doesn't mean you can't have a sanction and a consequence for that student for what's happened. And obviously then if you're not feeling supportive with you, then there's a different route you can go down in terms of obviously complaining, speak to your union for advice. If you're not supported on that. But what should happen is the policy should be followed. So when you're doing your follow-up, it's important that you log everything, and do log that information straight away and accurately get statements. Don't necessarily try and investigate it yourself if there's other statements need to be taken from students, and please don't take offence if whoever's investigating seeks to get statements from other students, really, because what they're trying to do is build a picture of what's gone on so that they can report back to the parent accurately. It's not about questioning you. As a professional, you should be trusted, and a lot of times students will turn around and say, oh, you believe me over the teacher, sorry, believe the teacher over me. And to some extent that should be true, because we're professionals, we should be trusted until there's a reason not to. But actually, by getting those statements, sometimes it's just really powerful to go back to a parent and say, look, you know, the teacher said this, and the other students who witnessed it, because we do that for like kind of belt and braces of gathering all that information together. From my experience, most students who do actually swear at a teacher will tend to just say, yeah, I said that, because they're angry or annoyed and own up to it. Where it kind of the water gets muddied a little bit is where sometimes if a teacher hasn't done quite the right thing and then the student has kind of swore at them and they kind of feel like they're justified, and then it gets into a bit of an argument about it, and the teacher sometimes won't tell you all of the information that's gone on before in terms of what the argument. So it's best to be really honest. You know, in my history of a teacher, I've said things I shouldn't have done, and realised afterwards that I've antagonised a student and they've said something to me that's inappropriate, and I've looked at it and gone, well, actually that was my fault. Doesn't mean there can't be a consequence, you know, for that child for being verbally abusive to you, but we just have to accept that sometimes we're human beings and we make mistakes as well. So the follow-up's really important in terms of document it, evidence it, don't investigate it yourself, pass it on to another member of staff, to your pastoral team, head of year, or to SLT, and then that student should be picked up and dealt with, and obviously the consequence for it should follow through. Now, here's my other advice for new teachers particularly, is often I'll hear staff turn around and say, well, no one ever comes back to me, no one tells me what's happened, no one's giving me the consequence. And in an ideal world, everyone would feed back to you, but normally pastoral teams are very, very busy, and normally, particularly when I get incidents coming in, I'm just looking to get them resolved, issue the sanctions, deal with the behaviour, put in any support that needs to be put in place, and move on swiftly to the next one so that we can try and get through some of those things and support people. It's not ignoring things, it's just often the feedback is one of the last things that we get to. So sometimes schools have a system, we have a system where we try and fill in paperwork and pass it back to people so they know what's happening. We also put it in emails and let people know, and it goes onto our behaviour system so people can check it out. But there's nothing wrong with you following up, and actually I think it's really good advice to go back to whoever's dealt with that incident of you being swore at and say to them, oh, can I just have some feedback as to what happened, can you let me know the outcome? Ideally they'll let you know, but don't be offended if they don't, because the pastoral teams are very, very busy. So that's one of the things you can do. The other thing you can actually do is, if you know that there has been a suspension and you want to be involved with the readmission meeting, it's really powerful for you to be there. It's really powerful if you ask for the permission to be in that readmission meeting, because you want to say, look, I want to talk to the parent about what's happened, why it escalated, or why it got to where it did. Ask for permission. Hopefully be allowed to go. Now, it really does just depend on, you know, your relationship with that student. You know, you need to be really honest about, is that something that's going to be productive? I have unfortunately been in situations where I've had a teacher who's wanted to be in those meetings, and I'm thinking sometimes they're not the best person to be there because they might antagonize the situation, make it worse. And that's about those relationships. But majority of times it should be a really positive thing, should be an experience you can do. You can go in there and be part of that meeting, because ultimately if the child has swore at you, you want to be there in the meeting, you want to be involved, and so it's important that you get that opportunity. So in the follow-up, that's one of the best things you can do, is be part of that. Make sure you're part of the readmission so the student can be then brought back into the lesson and be made really clear that that cannot happen. So 5 steps, really nice and simple. Ultimately, the last thing really is about being clear that what you want as an outcome is for it not to happen again. Sometimes when we deal with behaviour, people get hung up on the sanction rather than the outcome. And what I mean by that, I'll give you an example, is I remember talking to staff about uniform, and we'll say, right, students must have their blazer, and the first question normally gets asked to me is, what happens if they don't? What sanction do they get? And I'm like, you're missing the point. What you should be saying is, okay, if they don't have their blazer, how can I insist that they have got a blazer? How do we check it? How do we follow it up? How do we make sure that we've got that blazer in place? And then if they refuse to do those things, then we'll put the sanction in. But sometimes we're so sanction focused that we lose the reason of why we're trying to correct the behavior and what we actually want as an outcome. We need to be outcome based. So that way, when it comes to swearing, what we're actually saying is, we just don't tolerate this. We don't want it to happen again. What we can't do is just focus on saying, well, we'll suspend them and then that'll teach them a lesson, because ultimately the reality is that yes, sometimes suspensions work, but for some students, particularly if they've got difficult backgrounds, they don't make any difference. What this suspension actually does is build a log of that information, so that if they don't change, then further steps can be taken. But ultimately, The change in the behaviour comes from the conversation, not from the sanction. The change in behaviour comes from when we talked about the power of praise in one of the previous episodes. That's where you get the student to start doing things differently. If you're not having that dialogue and that conversation, you're not going to get a change just from a sanction, because ultimately the students that would change because of the sanction probably won't do it in the first place because they don't want the sanction. So it's just being really clear on that. Coming back to when a student swears at you, stay calm, address the behaviour, explain the consequences, redirect the conversation, and follow it up, making sure you stick to your policy. The most important thing is don't get into a one-to-one row with a student over something that they've said, and don't let it eat you up, particularly in your early years as a teacher. It's very easy. I've seen teachers come out of lessons totally destroyed because a child has said something to them that they've taken really personally. And don't get me wrong, children are great. They're very good at finding the little thing to say that will destroy you in a second. You know, whether it's like, you know, I've been called bold many times, and some of the horrible names as well. And it's because they just want to say something to hurt you, because at that moment in time, you are dealing with them and making them feel uncomfortable and pushing them into a direction they don't want to go. Like I said, it's two things, either something they want or something they want to avoid. So stay calm, follow it up, and make sure that you don't take it personally. But seek advice and help from your colleagues. Do talk to someone. Never leave school without having talked to someone. Get that issue off your chest, but remember not to take it personally. But do reflect on the things that you might do or change if you know it's someone who's a tricky, difficult individual, because ultimately the students have got, some of them have got quite tough backgrounds. For some of them, there's no excuse. They're just being rude and they do need to be dealt with, but it's about being clear about what we want as an outcome. Ultimately, as an outcome, we want to make sure that students are not rude, are not disrespectful to staff, because staff work hard and they're there to try and help them. Be part of that dialogue. Okay, hopefully that's useful. Look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care.